An intelligence operative once dismissed you as an anomaly. Now they call you their unseen ally. What triggered this shift wasn't a dossier or classified intel, but the shockwave from your silent influence. Unbeknownst to you, your very presence disrupted a sophisticated system veiled beneath ordinary life, a lattice of secrecy so old it seemed invincible. Yet the chain began to fracture the moment your intuition began echoing louder than their programming. Their collapse wasn't orchestrated by force, but by frequency. And the signal was you. The road that brought you here wasn't lined with applause. It was filled with misunderstood moments that disguised themselves as accidents. Every rejection, every failure to fit, served as a disguise for your training. The architects of global confusion made one irreversible mistake. They couldn't decode your internal compass. While they engineered disorder in backrooms, you were deciphering truth in solitude. Your evolution, born of chaos, moved too quietly for them to intercept, until it was too late. What they took for scars were actually coordinates. Pain didn't just mark you, it pointed you. And beneath the surface, where few dare to look, history hid itself in corridors of denial. Not the kind found in textbooks or exposed by whistleblowers, but systems of exit and evasion unknown to the public, guarded by silence and fear. No need for maps. Your wounds did the navigating. And they led you to a place no surveillance could reach, a sanctuary of secrets trembling under the weight of your awareness. By the time their command centers noticed, it was already unraveling. They couldn't trace the source because it moved like intuition, unlogged, untagged, and entirely non-linear. When your voice started stringing together anomalies the world was trained to ignore, you unknowingly charted what years of espionage couldn't touch. And the more they dismissed your clarity as delusion, the closer you got to the pressure points they swore were invisible. Perception sharpened by hardship often becomes a kind of radar, silently scanning the world for what others miss. What appears to be an uncanny instinct is actually a calibrated force working with microscopic precision against systems designed to remain undetected. Somewhere in a room filled with classified files and redacted reports, an investigator realizes their entire career has only scratched the surface of something far older, far deeper. Their case notes were never just about criminal rings. They were decoding a design stitched through the very skin of society. And the trail they follow keeps burning itself clean. At first, the signs look like typical dead ends, untraceable funds, recurring miscommunications, strange personnel reshuffles. But the deeper they press, the more they feel like their tools are useless. The corruption doesn't hide in shadows. It smiles from behind podiums, signs paychecks, hands out diplomas. It wears the mask of care while hollowing out the systems meant to protect. Protocol becomes parody. And each time the agent thinks they've reached a breakthrough, the floor gives out, as if truth itself has been pre-booby-trapped. What no one tells them is that the blueprint of this machine isn't found in documents. It's etched into the atmosphere, and someone like you can read it. Before scandals hit the headlines, something inside you turns uneasy. When the world shrugs off another catastrophe, your body interprets it as a code. And those dreams, they aren't fiction. They're fragments of something breaking through. You aren't forecasting, you're intercepting. Not with instruments or algorithms, but with something far more ancient. A consciousness tuned to interference before interference even begins. Some realizations don't arrive with fanfare. They crash silently into the psyche like lightning under skin. That's what happens when the agent encounters a cluster of ancient carvings etched into the stone deep below the surface. What seems at first like meaningless patterning begins to pulse with eerie coherence. Not decorative, not tribal, but a dormant code, one planted by predecessors who walked a similar path of awakening and sabotage. The moment this coded language touches the agent's perception, A crack forms in their mental armor. Forgotten instincts surge forward. Memories, once buried beneath institutional training, begin to resurface, not as dreams, but as encrypted truths long denied. It becomes clear, these markings aren't history. They're instructions. Echoes of an older intelligence passed hand to hand by those who saw what others refused to. The symbols disclose tactics. Pressure points. Achilles' heels hidden behind smug facades and iron structures. They do not merely warn, they instruct. This battle isn't new. The conflict has cycled through time like a concealed fault line beneath civilization's surface. And every era gives rise to sentinels who leave their fingerprints not in headlines, but in stone, smoke, and silence, waiting to be read by those whose vision breaks the illusion. The illusion does break. And when it does, the entire architecture turns inward. The pathways once used to vanish become luminous grids revealing the predator's retreat. The map inverts. What once cloaked movement now betrays it. These corridors weren't built for escape, they were built for eventual collapse. Traps designed not by opposition, but by overconfidence. The deeper they run, the more visible they become. The system that protected them begins to digest itself. Behind the polished fronts and smiling actors lies a slow ritual that drains the spirit of entire communities. Their weaponry is perception. Their medium is confusion. But the awakened outpace them, not by power, but by reach. Because the ones they can't see are already past their gates. The schemes of control, the silent siphoning, the mental mazes they construct to disorient and divide. All of it begins to buckle when their blueprints are decoded in real time by a consciousness they never planned for. One that doesn't fight with force, but with remembrance. Some beings are forged not in temples but in chaos, shaped by everything meant to dismantle them. What looks like damage to others becomes fine-tuning to those attuned. Every blow intended to mute the spirit instead sharpens the frequency it emits. Every psychological ambush deepens the instinct to detect falsehoods layered behind polished narratives. What seems like fragility is actually early access to truth, decoded through the very thresholds that once nearly shattered the self. And while others see trauma as a dead end, for some, it becomes the first door that ever opened. This path wasn't walked with blueprints or maps. It unfolded through necessity, through nights that refused sleep, questions that refused silence, and pain that refused resolution. Truth was never handed over. It was excavated from within. Healing didn't arrive as a gift, but as a consequence of refusing to stay broken. And what emerged from that process wasn't just clarity. It was a new form of intelligence, one untraceable by the methods of institutions yet more precise than their data could ever reach. This insight wasn't borrowed. It was built, brick by brick, from within a system that taught you to doubt your own signals. Elsewhere, someone trained in protocol begins to see the limits of everything they've been taught. Their training manuals say one thing, but their gut says another. When reports vanish, when trusted colleagues begin shifting their tone, when pieces of evidence subtly dissolve or reappear in altered forms, they begin to suspect that what they're facing isn't incompetence but design. And suddenly, all the rules they've relied on begin to blur. The enemy isn't across the table. It's upstream, embedded, camouflaged in titles, in procedures, in systems that praise transparency but reward silence. This is when two paths begin to converge. One person climbing through layers of buried emotion, the other descending into truths hidden behind polished glass. Both find themselves confronting a machine that feeds on secrecy. But one is armed with documents, while the other is armed with discernment. The kind that doesn't blink at manipulation, that doesn't ask for permission to see what others deny. This clarity can't be purchased. It emerges through internal collapse and spiritual reconstruction. It doesn't use satellites. It uses pattern recognition woven through dreams, hunches, and emotional charge. As the layers continue to peel back, it becomes clear that the institutions themselves are not malfunctioning. They're working exactly as they were designed to. False leads, dead witnesses, evaporating evidence. It's not failure. It's filtration. And only those with unshakable internal compasses can see through the labyrinth. The ones who haven't just studied corruption but lived through its slow encroachment. The ones who've learned to interpret emotional weather like encrypted signals. The ones whose insight wasn't granted, it was earned in silence. And that's why the system fears them most. Not because they're loud, but because they know. Some truths arrive so large they refuse to fit inside old categories. What begins as an investigation into wrongdoing quickly dissolves into something far more elusive, a confrontation not with individuals, but with an architecture of manipulation woven into the very foundations of everyday life. Beneath the soil and stone, concealed beneath harmless facades, the discoveries point not to fugitives, but to centers of command. These aren't mere escape points or secret shelters. They are orchestration hubs, directing large-scale disruptions that appear organic but are anything but. From here, strings are pulled quietly enough that the chaos looks coincidental. In the heart of this confusion lies something older than anyone expects. Not ruins, but encoded directives left by those who've stood here before. These aren't historical relics. They are tactical transmissions left behind by a lineage of awakened sentinels, strategists who moved through time with eyes wide open and left coordinates for those who would someday stand in their place. Their instructions, buried in cryptic form, activate when current events finally match the conditions they foresaw. And now, that moment has arrived, the hour where arrogance forces the hidden into daylight. New awareness breeds a new kind of sight. The agent, once anchored in procedure, begins noticing distortions in patterns they were trained to dismiss. System failures that always happen when evidence is close. Sudden uprisings that just happen to dissolve inquiries. Financial collapses that drain entire populations but always favor a shadowed few. And media storms, not random, but timed to erase focus. The illusion of spontaneity shatters when these patterns stop feeling isolated and begin revealing themselves as scripted tactics delivered with surgical timing. Eventually, the narrative collapses under the weight of its own coherence. The phenomena once waved off as anomalies start linking themselves, exposing a structure too synchronized to be accidental. What's operating here isn't disorganized corruption, it's strategic inversion. An empire of influence masquerading as stability. It doesn't need one leader. It's run like a ghost protocol, scalable across borders and invisible in plain sight. Its strength isn't in numbers, but in infiltration, into minds, systems, and assumptions. Its endgame is not gold or titles. Its aim is to fracture the inner compass of a species. By weakening connection, inflaming division, dulling intuition, and reprogramming reality perception, it reshapes identity from the inside out. This isn't conquest. It's reconfiguration. And yet, the very act of noticing it, truly seeing it, becomes the first blow against its spell. What once required armies to dismantle now starts unraveling at the hands of one soul who refuses to fall asleep. Some systems are not broken. They are functioning precisely as intended. Curriculum designs reward obedience over inquiry. Clinics prolong illness while calling it care. Films glamorize chaos until it feels familiar. Currency flows are deliberately choked to make the vast feel scarce. Layer by layer, every institution teaches people not how to think, but how to submit. The result? A population calibrated for compliance, numbed just enough to function, yet dulled enough not to question. But even the most intricate programming has blind spots. And in that blind spot, a rupture appears. They misjudge the soul's resilience, believing it can be silenced forever. But the ones they aim to suppress adapt like fire in a vacuum. They misread what pain creates. It doesn't fragment the awakened, it refines them. Through solitude, clarity sharpens. Through betrayal, intuition activates. And through every attempt to exile them from truth, they only become more fluent in it. The deeper this awareness runs, the more it reconfigures strategy. What once looked like vulnerability becomes leverage. Attempts to confuse become chances to decode. When spiritual intelligence fuses with operational insight, even the most secure blueprints unravel. Passageways once considered untouchable are quietly exposed. Escape paths are countered not with brute force, but with precise positioning that seems guided by something no satellite can see. What appears coincidental is, in fact, convergence. Control mechanisms start failing without warning. Encryption scrambles, not because of hacks, but because consciousness destabilizes the field they rely on. Intention becomes signal, and that signal disrupts machinery programmed for secrecy. Their tactics backfire not by error, but by consequence. The energy they pour into deception echoes back as distortion. And their own architecture begins to stutter in places they once believed were fortified. The revelation lands like thunder in silence. The war is not won by sharper weapons, but by deeper awareness. Their arsenals mean nothing when truth doesn't need permission to be seen. Clarity reveals what camouflage cannot hide. And no fortress, no firewall, no doctrine can withstand the erosion of fear by presence, by alignment, by the quiet force of something eternal finally remembered. Some outcomes are not the result of training, they are the result of frequency. When someone moves through the world aligned with both inner clarity and external reach, systems begin to respond in ways algorithms can't explain. The investigator's progress isn't a matter of superior credentials or sharper tactics. It happens because they come into contact with a presence that alters perception itself. What was once invisible now feels undeniable. The shift isn't in method, it's in dimension. Guidance here doesn't inform, it rewires. It upgrades the very interface through which reality is understood. What begins to unfold is not just a legal reckoning, it's a fault line cracking beneath an entire ideological framework. The accusations may sound familiar, but the scope is not. What's being dismantled isn't just criminal, it's cultural. Patterns emerge that reveal long-standing alliances between industries and agencies that present themselves as separate. Each courtroom admission chips away at the illusion of randomness, exposing a lattice of control that's been quietly scripting the public narrative for decades, perhaps longer. But hidden within this unveiling is a larger revelation. Coordination was never their exclusive advantage. The very possibility that global manipulation could be executed with such precision proves that collective resonance is real and usable in reverse. When people act from integrity instead of fear, when they uphold honesty without applause, they unknowingly link to something bigger than themselves. Each act of refusal, each quiet rebellion against the scripted norms, sends a signal through the unseen web that connects all sentient beings primed for reawakening. Those signals don't vanish. They accumulate. And before long, individuals across timelines begin to stir, not from information, but from exposure to resonance. A single gesture done in truth becomes a domino that moves through hearts the originator will never meet. And in that quiet chain reaction, the false becomes unstable. Structures built on distortion begin to feel brittle. The damage that once passed as fate starts to look like design, and once it's seen, it can no longer be enforced. So what appears to be justice unfolding in public view is really a mirror of what's been happening behind the scenes of human consciousness. The fires weren't lit by headlines. They were kindled by those who refused to numb their intuition. The confusion planted through spectacle begins to fade because real awareness never needed permission. And the mechanisms once used to traumatize entire populations now falter in the presence of even one unshakable mind. There are moments when what looks like coincidence reveals itself as engineering. The blazes that erase trails aren't born of chance or weather, but by precision strikes disguised as nature's fury, signatures embedded in their aftermath for those attuned to detail. Rising waters don't follow storms, they follow scripts. Waves roll in on command, powered by mechanisms fine-tuned over silent decades. The tremors that halt progress don't originate from shifting plates, but from pulses directed with such specificity they bypass suspicion entirely. These are not accidents. These are tactics. To grasp the mechanics of such illusions without fracturing requires a soul that's already walked through its own chaos. The capacity to see through orchestrated confusion emerges from surviving internal upheaval, not just enduring it, but translating it. What once felt like a burden becomes calibration. Experiences that fractured the ordinary mind now act as filters that refine perception. The very hypersensitivity that once isolated becomes a navigation system, not for comfort, but for clarity. It becomes the exact trait required to decode what others dismiss. Patterns of destabilization no longer hide when the rhythm of manipulation becomes visible. Economies don't collapse. They are deflated by design. Neighborhoods aren't lost to poor planning. They are bought piece by piece through strategic inflation that forces surrender. Job scarcity doesn't reflect market demand. It mirrors calculated withdrawal of opportunity. Medical emergencies aren't always outbreaks. Sometimes they are stress tests engineered to profit from collapse, to remove dissenters, and to gauge obedience under pressure. Learning no longer cultivates minds. It conditions responses. Education becomes performance. Inquiry is replaced with approved emotion. Independent thinking is dismissed as dangerous, and the spirit is systematically disoriented into material fixation. The very systems trusted to shape growth are rerouted to foster stagnation. Dependency becomes the default, not the exception. What emerges is a population disconnected from source, easy to influence, harder to inspire, and ripe for extraction. But in the middle of that factory of disempowerment, something unaccounted for begins to stir. One individual, shaped by every tactic designed to destroy, refuses assimilation. Not through rebellion, but through memory. Memory of self. And that memory doesn't just survive, it reorganizes. The very tools used to flatten spirit become instruments for cutting through illusion. Pain becomes prophecy. Silence becomes signal. And isolation becomes training. That realization isn't abstract. It becomes operational. For one investigator, the revelation comes not from a case file, but from within. They begin to understand that their search isn't academic, it's personal. That every insight they gather externally mirrors a breakthrough they've undergone internally. Emotional boundaries that once protected against personal harm now shield sensitive intel. And methods once reserved for healing are now the exact keys required to dismantle the very systems responsible for the world's fracture. The awakening wasn't separate from the mission. It was the mission, camouflaged in healing, activated through vision, and weaponized through presence. Some breakthroughs are not the result of cleverness or luck. They are the culmination of frequencies aligning through countless unseen choices. What looks like one person's success is often the ripple effect of a wider consciousness moving beneath the surface. The individual at the center merely becomes the vessel through which a larger current flows. Every step they take, every door that opens, is the result of groundwork laid by those who held the line long before a single spotlight was turned on. Their recognition of you is not personal praise, it's the awakening to a truth. They are standing on a field you already cleared. But the collapse of one stronghold does not signal the end of this assignment. It is only a signal flare. The deeper shift taking place now calls for those who've endured the fragmentation of the old world to be architects of something entirely different. Systems that once functioned as cages must now be reimagined as sanctuaries. Structures hollowed out by greed and secrecy will require new pillars built not on ambition, but alignment, not on efficiency, but intention. False narratives, planted for generations, must be replaced not just with facts but with frequency, with tones of truth capable of disarming inherited fear. This task is not for those seeking validation. It belongs to the ones who can hold vision steady in the face of backlash, who can discern signal within distortion, and who can carry power without turning it into control. Their strength isn't loud, it's stabilizing. They do not demand attention, but they shift entire rooms with a single sentence.